Hey there, friend. This show originally released in the fall of 2020, but I think it is just as relevant today. My guest Catherine and I mention the presidential candidates, and one of those candidates is different this time around, as you know, but it doesn't change the tremendously helpful information and perspective that my guest shares. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. Hey there, you're listening to the Girls Talking Life podcast, and I'm your host, Johanna. If you're like me, you love time with friends. I always leave feeling encouraged, inspired to try something different, or I've learned something new. So why not continue to grow even when we can't be with our girlfriends? We're not made to do life on our own. So in each episode of this show, I'll bring you a girl and her story to give you refreshing ideas to stir your soul. Let's walk this road together. Are you ready to talk life? Welcome to another Girls Talking Life Extra. It's not a full show, just a short chat. And typically I'm talking with a past guest, but today I've brought someone on who's brand new. Because of the season we're in, with the election just a few weeks away, I thought it would be helpful to have a discussion about engaging in the political conversation, making biblical-based decisions, and practically preparing to go to the polls. I am talking with Catherine Papai-McMillin. Catherine is a mama of three, a high school government teacher, and a passionate citizen. Here is our conversation. Hello, Catherine. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with me on the show today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I came across an article you wrote in a newsletter for my friends, Rich and Shawless Church, Sanctuary Columbus, and I really liked what you had to say, and I am so glad that you're willing to talk with me. Introduce yourself and tell me why you want to talk about politics and government to me today.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Catherine Papai-McMillin, and I'm actually a government teacher. So that's my main reason why I'm so excited about talking about politics and voting. But I also was raised to participate civically, like that was an important thing to do, that voting was important. So I grew up with that as my background. And so that translated then for me into being a government teacher and enjoying working with students. I love all the conversations that I have with them. It's very exciting to work with young people and to take them from, what is this? Why does it matter? Who cares if I vote? To, yes, voting is important. I'm going to be engaged. I am going to work in my communities for the change that I want to see. So for me, it is that excitement of connecting with people and not just sort of the abstract idea of politics or voting itself.
That's so cool. As I don't even need to say, tensions are high this year for so many reasons. And I feel like anytime we turn on the news or we watch something on social media, everything feels so divisive. If you're familiar with the Enneagram, I am a 9, which is the peacemaker. So my personality is not to have any conflict, not to have any confrontation. So when this topic comes up, Catherine, I really just want to run away. Like, I really just don't want to engage in the conversations. But I also know that as a follower of Christ, sometimes we're called to speak up. So what are the ways that we can engage in these conversations and engage in them well?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important is to not come into a conversation with the idea of it being a debate and I'm going to convince you of the way that things are, but more to actually come in to listen to what the other person has to say about why the things are important to them that are important to them, and about why they see the world the way that they do. Because with politics, it comes down, people react viscerally because it comes down to core beliefs, right? And so when you discuss politics, you are a lot of times discussing your identity. And so for someone to come in and say you're wrong is an attack on your identity, right? And so I think that we need to some extent, disentangle ourselves from that, because politics doesn't necessarily have to be our identity the same way that, like, being a Christian is part of a core identity, right? Like, being Democrat or Republican isn't on the same level, or being independent or Green Party, Libertarian, right? Whatever your political affiliation or non-affiliation happens to be. So there is some element of disentangling ourselves from that. But it's also just really important to listen to what people have to say, because a lot of times the way people are voting is because of beliefs that they have about certain issues, the way that they view the world. And so it helps us to understand where another person is coming from and to say that is a belief that person has. Maybe I don't agree with that belief, but can I understand that belief? Can I understand where that person's coming from? And then have a more productive conversation. And so I think conversations run better when we listen and ask questions than if we come in waving our index cards of facts at each other.
And I think that's true whether we're talking about politics or not.
Right. Yes. Yeah. It's just, good listening skills. Yeah.
Right. Right. You say that our citizenship in the kingdom of heaven calls us to action in our current earthly kingdom. And one of the ways that we can take action is by voting. As a follower of Jesus, do you have a process that you use to look at issues through a biblical lens? Or do you have a way that you make good choices for yourself?
Yes, I would say that my views have changed probably over the course of my adult life in terms of how I approach voting and the decisions that I make about who I vote for as I've come to a deeper understanding of the character of God. And so I think what's important to me is to look at what is important to God. And the way that I look at that is when you look at the Bible, what are the themes that are repeated? What are the names of God that are repeated, right? Because that, I think, is where you see what God cares about the most. And I think there's a lot of passages in scripture that kind of get blown out of proportion or given a lot of weight. And when you look at the Bible as a whole and see the process of God over time and see the way that the prophets and the psalmists and the people of Israel address God and what he cares about and what they end up getting in trouble for with God over time, right? And then sort of the mission and the directives of Jesus then in the New Testament, you see the character of God revealed. And so for me, it's important to try to make my decisions based on what I think is important to God. And I don't know that that's always what we think it might be. So I think there's a lot of inspection of oneself that has to happen when one is voting to ask, am I judging these politicians based on the way that maybe, God would see them, or the way that kind of a knee-jerk reaction, or the way that I've been hearing in the media to see them. And I think that's another thing that's important too, is you have to get past the headlines. I would say get off of social media completely if you want to find out what's really going on with the candidate and their issues, the way that they stand on issues. It's not helpful. Most of the stuff that's on social media is there to inflame you and to just make you angry and make you go click on things and more things so that they can get more eyeballs, right? And so I think it's really important to look at a range of sources, try to stray out of whatever bubble you typically find yourself in. So if you find yourself in a liberal bubble, check the other side. If you find yourself in a conservative bubble, look at the other side and be willing to be open to what's being said, because there are narratives that get taken up and get a lot of oxygen and a lot of space on media, but aren't necessarily the whole story. And I found that time and again, when I've seen stories in the news that I actually have personal knowledge of for whatever reason, and they're not the full story, or they'll run with one side and the other side gets left out. So I think it's just really important to remember that too, when looking at candidates and evaluating them, see what's being said over time about them, see what's being said, and stories that aren't the headlines. And if you can find sort of maybe even character testaments about them from people that know them well versus what the media is making them into, I think that's helpful. Of course, it's really hard for candidates at the local level. It's more like national candidates. But I think one thing that's really important to remember is that local candidates have a tremendous effect on our lives and the lives of our fellow citizens. So the judges that you vote into office in Ohio, if you're a voter in Ohio. I know you said some people listen outside of Ohio, but in Ohio we elect our judges. And so judges have a tremendous effect on people's lives if they have to go through the court system. And your city council members have a tremendous impact on your lives, like the ordinances that you're going to have to live with in your city. And then state politics a lot of times ends up affecting us a lot more than national politics, but we follow the national stories. And there's a whole range of reasons for that I won't get into, but we tend to follow national stories, but the state laws make a big difference. So I think it's really important to pay attention to those state and local races as well, and find out what you can. And the advantage with the local races is you might actually run into that person in a restaurant, right? Or the grocery store, and you can talk to them and they'll probably be glad to have a conversation with you.
That's such a great point, and something that I don't think about often. I was listening to something recently and they were talking about, it was a daughter of a candidate of a man who had run for president. And she was talking about those narratives being spun out of control. And she said, you have to remember, this is a person with a family. And
yes,
just because this is one issue and he feels differently or she feels differently than you do, they have so many other characteristics and life stories that you could relate to as well.
Right. Yes, that's good advice. And I think too, that is, in the Bible, it says God does not see the same way people see, right? People look at the outside, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so that is something to remember too, especially I think if you find your blood pressure rising, you're like, oh, I can't believe they just did that. It's like, you can be angry at the action, but remember that underneath there is a person that God loves no matter what, right? So yeah, we may not be happy with the decisions that they make, but the Lord loves unconditionally.
I've heard from several people recently that, they want to do their part. They want to vote, especially for president, but they don't feel like either President Trump or former Vice President Biden is the right choice for our country right now. What do you do when neither candidate seems like the right one?
I would say, again, think about the choice that you're making, not just for yourself, but how that choice is going to affect the people in your community. And again, going back to that idea of what's important to God, where is his heart at? And so which candidate is most likely to enact policies that would bring about, God's vision, God's justice in the world. And I think, that we're called to enact that as much as we can in God's vision of the earth as much as we can while we're here. Of course, it won't be renewed until Jesus comes back, but we do what we can, right, while we're here. That would be one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is change the system. So we are forced into a two-party system because of our electoral system. We have this first past the post, winner take all, right? So you don't even have to win 50% of the votes. You just have to win more than whoever else is running and you get all of the votes. And it forces us into a two-party system. And so I would say, if you don't like the fact that we have two candidates typically to choose from, work on changing our electoral system. So places like Maine are experimenting with ranked choice voting, where you can vote for the person that you truly believe would be the best person for our country or for, your state or your city at the time. But then you kind of rank the other candidates in the order of I can live with if this had to happen. And so you do get to vote your conscience under a system like ranked choice voting. It's not where now with the two-party system, if you vote third party, essentially you've thrown your vote away, right? And that it's probably not going to make a difference because not enough people are going to vote for third party because they know that third party is not going to win. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But this two-party system has existed for our entire history, essentially, because of the way that we vote. So, yeah, I would say work on changing the system. And there's more calls for that. And people are starting to do that more, experimenting with different options. I'm not saying we need to move to parliamentary democracy. There's issues with that as well. But yeah, if we change up first past the post or winner take all, then I think more people would feel better about voting. I can understand why people feel like I can't choose either candidate because, well, all candidates are flawed, right? They're all human, but some we might feel more strongly about than others. And so those are the two things I would say. Like, don't just leave it at, well, I can't vote for either. Like, work to make that change. If you don't feel like you can vote for either, let's change the system so that we can have a voting system we all feel good about.
I like that. Thank you. That's very interesting. So what resources or encouragement would you offer to the woman who's feeling overwhelmed or discouraged with the thought of voting in next month?
Well, I would say, first of all, I totally understand that feeling. I think that it helps if you prepare your ballot before you go in. I always do. Prepare a sample ballot. And in Ohio, it's really nice that there are resources in terms of figuring out who the best candidate to vote for judge is. And so I would look for that in your state. It's usually done by the bar associations in a state or in a locality that they will rank the candidates for judge. And I find that to be very helpful so that the ballot isn't so overwhelming. I like to use vote411.org. It's a great nonpartisan resource that just shows you what's on the ballots, and then they will ask candidates to respond to a series of questions. I don't like to vote. This is me personally, but I don't like to vote for candidates that didn't answer questions, especially if it's to like a local paper of record. I'm like, well, if you want to, get my vote, please give me some information about yourself. Right. I don't feel comfortable voting for someone I have no information on. But that's a personal thing for me. So I think that for a lot of people, it feels overwhelming because they're not sure how to get to the information to make an informed choice. At least I know that in the past, before I found all the resources that I have, that's how I felt. I was like, I feel like I'm throwing cards up in the air for who to vote for judge or some of these other offices. I don't know how to make a good decision here. And then once I had those resources, I felt peace about voting for judge and some of the other offices. So I think that informed voting helps to cut down overwhelmed or stressful voting. And I think also for me, one thing I try to remember and keep in mind is that it doesn't matter in the end who wins the election. For us, our mission does not change. As Christians, our mission is, eternal, more or less. So what we are supposed to do, what God calls us to do, it doesn't matter who occupies the governorship or the White House. We have to keep doing what we're called to do. And God, in the end, is ultimately in control, come what may, in our country. So that too, when I get too worked up, I try to go back and hold on to that. And that brings me peace because, throughout history, we have seen what God can do. And so it's the way that sometimes I need to think about to sleep at night. Like, wait, God's got this. Okay. Got to trust in that.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And I love that you ended on that point. So find out what the candidates think about each issue and prepare your ballot ahead of time. And then in the end, know that God's in control. So it's okay. Yes. No matter which way it falls.
Yes. So I think that, if you voted, then you can feel good about what you've done because you have tried to make a difference in the way that things are and for other people in their lives.
Well, thank you for coming on, Catherine. I appreciate all your words. I am feeling less overwhelmed and like I have a plan.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So I appreciate that. I hope that my listeners feel the same way.
I hope so too. Johanna, thanks so much for having me. I had a good time.
It was really good to talk with you. Thanks, Catherine.
You're welcome.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Catherine. The past few years for me have been filled with a lot of stepping out of my comfort zone in many ways, and this conversation was no exception. As I mentioned during the show, politics is a topic I'd rather not touch, but I also felt like I needed some guidance, especially this year, and maybe you felt that way too. I hope this serves as a helpful resource to prepare your heart and your head for the election and beyond. I'll be back here with an all-new episode next week. Thanks for tuning in, friends.